Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of D&D Horror Stories. Running into a that guy or murder hobo is a risk everyone that enjoys tabletop RPGs takes when adding a new player to a party or a table. Though, there is a common theme to be on the lookout for that could be a sign that a new player will be one, and that is if they insist on playing a rogue. Much like what happens in the following stories. But before we get into those, I think we need a blessing from Comfy Lucky, the like and comment kitty, to help us endure the psychic damage that these stories are sure to inflict.
Hola, Lucky.
Thanks, Lucky. And Ziggy. Now, let's get into these stories. He was planning on killing them all from the first session. By Reddit user, Literal Garbage Yo. Hello again. Last week I posted a relatively mild horror story about a player who refused to make a character that would work with the party. To my pleasant surprise, the post really blew up, so I decided I'll share one of the many stories as to why that rule exists in the first place. For those who didn't see my previous post, I have two simple rules when it comes to character creation. 1. The character has to make sense in the world conceptually. And 2. The character has to see themselves as a member of the party and a participant in the adventure. Disclaimer: this story happened almost 10 years ago. I'll try to retell it as faithfully as possible, but my memory is not a steel trap, and things blur as the years go by. Also, it can easily be said that I bear a decent amount of blame for how this turned out. I can own that. A bit of backstory. Our regular DM had just graduated from college and accepted a job halfway across the country. I volunteered to step into his shoes and become our new DM, and let me just say that those were some big shoes to fill. He was known for crafting absolutely brilliant homebrew worlds, complete with riveting storylines and thrilling combat. Maybe it's nostalgia speaking, but there were very few things that he could not do well. However, we as a group did have one regular complaint. He could be limiting when it came to character creation. We could only choose from a relatively small selection of races and classes, and were usually steered towards a good alignment. He was big into heroic archetypes. Not the end of the world though. We still had a lot of fun, but some of us were itching to play something a little different. So when I took over, in my infinite wisdom, please read that last line with as much sarcasm as possible. I got you, fam. I decided to lift all restrictions on race, class, and alignment. Most players went for some flavor of chaotic neutral, except for one, who we will refer to as Rogue. Rogue texts me one day and asks if I mind if he plays a chaotic evil character. Me, being an immature 20-year-old who enjoys playing evil characters in games like Oblivion and Fallout, as well as being an inexperienced DM who's never had to deal with the headaches that murder hobos inevitably bring, said that this sounded like a fantastic idea. Rogue starts off his antics almost immediately in the first session by executing a bandit that the rest of the party had captured and was going to set free once they interrogated him. This sets off a big argument between all of the characters. In character, out of character, they were all smiles and laughs, and almost breaks up the party from the get-go. To my relief, Rogue has his character back down and apologize, so the party lets the issue drop. This didn't stop the Rogue from murder hoboing, however. He just decided to get smarter about how he went about it. He would come up with very elaborate plans to off NPCs who had slighted him. To the player's credit, these plans were generally well thought out and allowed him to avoid detection from both his party as well as the authorities. To make these plans work, he would regularly buy, loot, and steal any item he found useful. He had an inventory full of utility items, like potions and scrolls, that all had unique effects. In the beginning, I admit that we were all entertained by Rogue's antics. The other players even egged him on at times, out of character of course. None of us had experienced a murder hobo before, so this was a new and interesting experience for us all. The novelty, however, quickly wore off. As the sessions wore on and months went by, we would begin to get annoyed that Rogue was taking up more and more time with his murder plots. In hindsight, I should have done something to manage the situation, but I was still very inexperienced at this time and not very confident in what I could do. Then, finally, we get to the night of the incident. After a successful mission, the party visits a local inn to rest and celebrate. Rogue invites the party back to his room so that they can have some drinks in private and plot out their next course of action. He pours everyone a glass of wine, but it's only after each character had taken a drink that he reveals that he had laced the wine with a powerful sleeping draught. He then tells me that his character waits until everyone is asleep, and then proceeds to empty several jars of oil across the room. He then walks out of the room and throws a torch down on the floor before he shuts the door. Once the door is shut, he pulls out a scroll of arcane lock and magically locks the door shut, leaving the rest of the player characters to die in a horrible blaze. After a few moments of shocked silence, everyone at the table starts shouting simultaneously, saying that they wouldn't have drank the wine, asking to roll insight, asking to make a save, anything and everything that could potentially save their characters. It took me longer than I'm proud of, but I eventually gathered my wits. I asked the rogue what prompted his character to commit this act, since it seemed out of character for him to suddenly turn against his friends. He responded that he didn't technically need a reason, as his character was chaotic evil, but since I asked, he pulled out a journal that he wrote from the perspective of his character. It was full of perceived slights from every member of the party, leading back all the way to the argument in the first session. It became clear that he had been planning this for months, since the very beginning of the campaign. I was stunned, to say the least. This was a campaign that I had spent a considerable amount of time on, and it had just gone up in flames, literally. Awkwardly, I called an end to the session so I could figure out how to handle the situation appropriately. Everybody left grumbling, except for Rogue, who walked out with a self-satisfied smirk. The next morning, I called my old DM for advice. After tearing me a new one for not accounting for the time zone difference between us, he coached me through how to handle the rolls and saves that would be needed to be made for Rogue's plan to go into effect. But he told me the better idea was just to retcon the whole session, which is what I ended up doing. Rogue wasn't happy and ended up leaving the campaign, but realistically, the campaign would have ended if I let him get his way, so no big loss there. And there you go. This story is a major reason why I make sure all my players now make characters that willingly work together, and it goes without saying that they shouldn't drug and incinerate their party either. Looking back now, I cringe at how I handled a lot of this, but I've learned a lot and improved over the years. Sucking at something is the first step towards being kind of good at something. TLDR, Rogue plots for months to kill the entire party, and my dumbass almost let it happen. It's one thing to want to play a character that is generally evil, but it's another thing to want to secretly want to kill off the entire party in a campaign. That is not only disrespectful to the other players, but a dick move for the DM, as they are spending time making a world for you all to play in. At least OP learned from the experience, and has since sent those ground rules for anyone coming into a campaign. Let's move on. I don't get why you guys bully my character. By Reddit user, Grey Burrito. I've been listening to D&D Horror Stories from YouTube channels like Crispy's Tavern and D&D Doge. If you read this, give the like kitten some extra treats from me. Will do. So, I decided to share my only real horror story that I've experienced. I should start off by mentioning that this was my first ever role-playing campaign, and was also like 5 years ago, so my memory is a tad fuzzy on the details, so bear with me. The cast are me, a dragonborn sorcerer, half-elf paladin, my friend who somehow manages to nat 1 85% of his rolls, and ends up dying in very silly ways nearly every session, not relevant to the story. Human fighter, who has a tendency to gamble with his life over dumb stuff that didn't really matter. The GM, and then we have a human rogue, the problem player, who lives by, "That's what my character would do." The game was Pathfinder, and this was my first ever role-playing experience, with my first ever friend group. Right away, during character creation, the rogue kept arguing that they should have a buff to their racial bonus because humans, only, get an extra feat and +2 racial bonus to any ability score of their choice. And this was, apparently, really underpowered. When we suggested that they could just play another race, they said, "But I want to play human, and it isn't fair that I don't get any dark vision." They argued over this for well over a half hour, before finally accepting that the rest of the party did not think we should give her a buff for being human. Once in game, the rogue was very into their character and played them as how they would act. The problem, however, was that they liked playing, in their own words, a-hole characters, who, in multiple battles, decided to run away and leave the party to fight while they just sat around. This included boss battles, which often left the party in bad shape, since, we were one player short for major fights. Whenever we were in town, and they were short on money to buy whatever it was they wanted, they would resort to pickpocketing me for gold, since I was very bad at noticing it in-game. And worse yet, at one point, they decided to pickpocket a guard and got caught. Their solution to this dilemma? Use persuasion to blame our fighter for the crime, thus getting them arrested. Another charming quirk of their character was that if they got into big trouble, like, say, piss off 8 highly trained armed guards while the rogue was level 3, they would try to go full-on main character and attempt to ninja run and parkour out of every situation. And naturally, they got grumpy every time they failed. They also had a habit of arguing with other players over any little thing that inconvenienced their character, to the point that entire hours would just be them arguing over small things like, "How can you grapple me when I'm a fast rogue and you are a slow sorcerer holding a cane? You should have disadvantage on your rolls." I was attempting to stop them from stabbing a goblin that had surrendered. We had a meeting about rulings, and they stated that GM should have final say, and that we should not contest the GM, which everyone but them were already doing, but sure. So we agreed, hoping that it would stop the constant interruptions. Of course, it did not. One of my favorite moments was an argument that lasted for 3 hours about GM's ruling that a natural 20 knowledge check should not give away all information about a creature that just literally came into existence. They did get hints based on its scale patterns that a certain spot is most likely easier to pierce, but they argued that a natural 20 should let them know everything about this eldritch thing that just this very moment entered our universe. The cherry on this sundae is that this was the session after that meeting about GM having the final say. Suddenly, it went from GM should have the final say to it's a team game and every player should have a say about any ruling. Which is fair enough. It is a team game, and I do believe that you can pull the GM aside after the game to talk about any concerns, but this is a bit much. I will admit that this discussion got me rather heated, which is rare. I am the type of person who almost never got angry at anyone. I tend to just get sad instead. But this one really frustrated me. So I did snap and said something really shitty, to which they got upset. I apologized for snapping right after I said the things, and honestly, they surprisingly forgave me quite quickly, even though they justifiably could have gotten quite mad at me. The thing that gets me is that the player did not understand why the party, in-game, did not like their character after all these shenanigans. They could not fathom how we could not like the character, and we were being unfair by being antagonistic against the rogue, because they were only doing what their character would do. We were obviously bullying their character because we didn't like the player. For those wondering why we didn't kick the player, it was the classic fear of friendship getting hurt coming into effect. The player in question was actually the one who got our entire friend group together, but due to other outside reasons, they are no longer talking with their group. But if you read this, I genuinely hope that you are doing well and life is going your way. There was a lot more that happened during our sessions, but this is already long enough, so I'm going to end it here for now. I do want to end it by saying that despite everything I've written here, the player really wasn't a bad person. They were just going through a lot at the time, and credit where credit is due. They were a great GM who came up with inventive and fun stories and dungeons. As of late, I've fallen off role-playing games, but the group is talking about starting up a new game, and I have some stuff cooking up as well. I hope I didn't bore you all too much, and I wish you all glorious rolls and fabulous adventures. While Rogue definitely sounded like a that guy, a lot of the actions that she took should have been called out by the DM. Leaving in the middle of fights, the antagonistic way that she would steal from the other characters, and trying to do things by herself. These things should have been talked about outside of the game way before any major progression of the campaign. Though, it does sound like they all finally talked it out later, and Rogue agreed that DM should have the final say, but only up until she didn't get her way again. Hopefully, their group's new foray into the tabletop RPG space will be a better experience this time. Let's move on. And as it's Friday, I'd like to start a new tradition on the channel and end the week with a happy D&D story in order to go into the weekend with a good vibe. So, let's begin now. TPK Averted by Weaponized Stupidity by Reddit user HeyCold. The setting: the classic Red Hand of Doom campaign that I had converted to 5e for my friends. So, our paladin with a level of artificer had been throwing light-infused stones further into a cave so that he could see what he was doing, as he didn't have dark vision. By doing so, he inadvertently alerted a large and difficult group of hobgoblin clerics and summoned wraiths into the next room, whilst the party was already dealing with a bunch of angry greenspawn razor fiends in the room that they were currently in. The party had been too long without a rest, and the wizard blew their last decent spell slot trying to fireball the new opponents. They rolled very badly for damage and killed none of them, going unconscious to a wraith immediately afterwards and dropping out of fly. This forced the party's monk to Prince of Persia wall run around the side of a huge chasm to dump a potion down their throat, leaving the pair of them way out of position for anyone else to help them. The paladin, ranger, and hexblade were pretty much out of spell slots and holding the line, but unable to break through to save their friends. The entire party was hemorrhaging hit points, and it looked bleak. As the DM, I was panicking, trying to think of a bone that I could throw them to not turn this into an ignominious TPK from bad luck, right before the final confrontation with the BBEG that was set to be the climatic end to the campaign. At that moment, a grin spread across the halfling ranger's face. She gave her panther a big hug goodbye and leapt from her back over the first rank of hobgoblins, placing herself squarely in the middle of the vast majority of the enemies. This is when she executed her cunning plan. She had been hanging on to an amulet of the plains that she had been gifted a while ago, despite her terrible intelligence score. She activated it, failing the intelligence roll, as was her plan. Suddenly, a portal opened, and she, along with every creature and object within 15 feet of her, was sucked through it into the first circle of Karsiri, to a chorus of laughter and cries of "what the fuck" from everyone in the game. She was happy for it to be a noble sacrifice, but what made it even better is that we were experimenting with re-rolling initiative at the top of each round, so she was able to beat all of her new traveling companions on the initiative order. In her next turn, she barely survived the opportunity attacks to sprint away from them and activated the amulet a second time, just scraping the DC to successfully zap herself back into the cavern to greet the rest of the party, who were easily dispatching the remaining enemies. TLDR, Ranger used Amulet of the Plains and her own weaponized stupidity to avert a TPK by transporting herself and most of the bad guys to a different plane of existence. Well, that certainly is a glory story as far as I'm concerned. I love hearing stories like this, where things look bleak and a player remembers an item they have and uses it in a creative and interesting way. I hope that OP gave that player a point of inspiration after that. They definitely earned it. But that will do it for today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Until next time.